Well, this is the time of year when the television season comes to an end. And some of our favorite television shows are coming to the end of their entire series. I will miss Modern Family. And others are ending their season with a cliffhanger, in the belief that a cliffhanger leaves us wondering throughout the summer months what will happen next, so that we'll be eager to tune in when fall comes. The writers leave, I'm sorry, we got a note that something's wrong with Nancy's iPad. But anyway, the writers leave a plot line that questions the fate of their characters. For instance, who killed JR? I know that dates me a lot, Dallas back in the 80s. But for instance, will our favorite characters get together? Will they break up? Will our favorite show return in the fall? What will come next? And frankly, that's a question many of us are asking right now. Because right now, life is a cliffhanger as we wait to see what will happen next. What comes when the doors to our homes are flung open and we are free to roam about as we choose? What comes next when the stores and restaurants open up and we're free to shop, eat out, and go to movies again? What comes next when schools reopen and teachers once again meet face-to-face with their students? What will come next? Well, cliffhangers are popular because the gospel writer Mark ended his gospel with a cliffhanger. The original version of Mark's gospel ended at the 8th verse of the 16th chapter. Mark shared the story of the women going to the tomb only to discover the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. They entered and saw a young man, an angel, sitting on the side of the bed where Jesus lay. And the angel said, Jesus is not here because he's been raised from death. And the angel told the women to go tell all of the disciples and Peter that Jesus would meet them in Galilee. They would see him there. But unlike the other Gospels, Mark ended with the women being too afraid to share the news. Mark wrote, the women fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And boom, that's where Mark's original Gospel ended. The women were too afraid to say anything to anybody about what they had seen. Now, Mark was the first of the Gospel writers out of the four, and he wrote his Gospel sometime in the early 60s, 30 years after Jesus returned to heaven. We know that the good news of Jesus had spread throughout the Roman Empire by the time he wrote his Gospel, because Paul the Apostle had gone throughout the Roman Empire along with a whole lot of other missionaries telling the story of the good news. Even so, Mark, after the word had spread, ended his Gospel with the women being afraid and saying nothing. Now, others added to Mark's Gospel later, but Mark himself chose to end the Gospel with the women saying nothing, with a cliffhanger. But why did he do that? I got to tell you, Mark's Gospel reminds me of the old movie Clue. It was a movie based on the board game where the object of the game was to name the killer. And if you are at home and have not seen that movie yet, watch it this afternoon. It's funny. The object of the game of Clue is to name the killer, the murder weapon, in the room in which the murder took place. And the movie Clue was filmed with 3 different endings. The audience in the theater was to choose the ending they wanted each time the movie was shown. And the idea was of getting to choose our own ending got people to, well, get involved with the movie. And I bought the premise hook, line, and sinker and paid to see that movie so many times until I saw all 3 endings. As a result, I heard and saw more in the movie each time I saw it. But by the time Mark wrote his Gospel, the story of Jesus being raised from death had been told by many people in many places with a variety of endings. Every person who told the story got to tell the ending the way they thought it should be. Now, Mark was writing without the ending because he was writing with a sense of urgency. He was writing during the time that the Roman legion was literally destroying the nation of Israel. and Jerusalem, the mother of all Christian churches, had been disbanded, and the faithful had fled to all corners of the empire as the legion got closer and closer and closer to the walls of the city. Mark also wrote while Nero was the emperor of Rome, and Nero absolutely hated Christians. He hated most people, but he hated Christians more than most. In fact, he hated any group of people who did not put him on a pedestal literally and worship him as God. So when 2/3 of the city of Rome burned, Nero blamed Christians for having started the fire, which opened the door to a persecution of Christians that Nero welcomed with open arms. So Mark wrote when following Jesus was not safe. People were afraid. They knew the truth. They didn't want to tell the rest of the story. So Mark wrote a cliffhanger. The women were afraid to tell anyone about Jesus, the risen Christ, because what would those listening to the story do? Would they report the people who told to Nero and the Roman legion? Would they tell the story, or were they afraid? Would Mark's generation of Christians continue to tell the story, or would they be the last generation of followers? Would the story of Jesus continue to be told, or would fear cause the story to end? Well, like I said before, we are living in the middle of a cliffhanger. And it's not a time of gross persecution for Christians in the United States, but it is a time that leaves us wondering what comes next. The COVID-19 pandemic has really turned our world and our lives upside down. It's disrupted our lives, it's disrupted graduations, it's disrupted business, world trade, travel, entertainment, and even something that should be as simple as going to the grocery store. What comes next? Well, like the women in Mark's gospel, that really depends on us. When this time of illness is past, we get to write the story of what comes next. And the story we tell will depend on how we've experienced this time. It will depend on how much time we've spent thinking about our lives and our world and our families, our education system, our businesses, and especially our connection with God. It will depend on what we believe our world can look like. I've heard people say we want to get back to life as normal. But as I read on Facebook, normal before the pandemic was not working for a lot of people. It was not working for our planet. It was not working for a lot of us who are watching today. And we can see how that not working and the illness is affecting our county and our state and our world and our lives. Because those who did not have enough before the pandemic are suffering more financial hardship and more illness than those of us who had more than enough. Our healthcare system and our healthcare workers are at the breaking point. And I gotta tell you, I don't think insurance is going to be the answer for most. Social isolation is pointing out the rampant epidemic loneliness that many have lived with for a long time. Small businesses that were on the edge may or may not open again. Before we go back to normal, let's ask ourselves if normal was working and we really want to go back to that. Because staying at home is bringing our families closer together as we find new and creative ways to connect. It's bringing our neighbors together as we find new and creative ways to connect. Families are getting more involved with their children's education, whether they want to or not. We're actually cooking at home. I've been cooking at home. You know how desperate times have gotten. But as a result, I think we're thinking more about what we're putting into our bodies and how we're spending our meal times. We're cherishing this time that we see others, even at a distance, and we take the time to talk and connect with people we normally don't connect with because human interaction is so precious. Many of us have realized how much we depend on our connection with our God and with the other members of our congregation. So what comes next will depend on how we decide to live and tell the story of our connection with God and the risen Christ. How we, as followers of Jesus, tell the rest of the story will depend on how much time we spent with God and with Jesus' message during this time. As we read the stories of Jesus and listen for the truth of his message and his teachings, we may begin to recognize some places where normal wasn't working, and we can do better, and our world can be better than it was before. Because, friends, we have the opportunity, now that things have been shut down, we have the opportunity, when they reopen, to build a better world than the one that was closed down just a month ago. This time apart allows us to think about and to practice how we're going to care for the sick, the lonely, the hungry, those who don't have enough, those who are homeless, and those who are in prison. This time apart allows us to think about how we're going to connect better with those people who have been marginalized, with the African American, the Hispanic, and the Hmong neighbors in our communities, our cities, and in our county. This time apart allows us to think about how we're going to use our God-given gifts when we can once again participate in education, healthcare, care facilities, Hope House, and all the places that have for long time begged for our help. This time apart allows us to think about how we will tell the story of the risen Christ in our lives, our actions, our attitudes, and our worlds when this world reopens. Do we want the world to go back to a normal that wasn't working for a lot of people? Or do we want to follow Jesus and help create something new, a world that grows closer to the kingdom of God on earth? When the world reopens, what can we do and what will we do to make our neighborhoods, our communities, and our world better than they were before? Thank goodness we have time to think about it. I urge us to spend time thinking about what wasn't working. Take a look at the pictures that the space station is sending back of the pollution in the world before and after the pandemic. Think about what we are missing right now, and is it something worth spending our time seeking again? Or can we do better? Think about what we really value right now. And is it something we want to continue to crave, or can we do better? Think about the time we spend with our families, now that we have to spend time with our families. Is it something that we want to continue? And how can we do it better? Or do we want to drift into our own worlds again? You see, Mark left the rest of the story up to those of us who were living and retelling the story. And Mark leaves the rest of the story up to us. How will we tell the story of Jesus, our risen Christ, in the way that we live when this world reopens? What comes next for us will depend on how we decide to live and tell the next chapter of the story. What comes next? That's up to us. May we tell it well. Amen.
Amen.